Hi, my name's Amy and I work in the activities department here at Baker. Today I'm going to be reading you a short story. The story is by Jack London and it's called To Build a Fire. Day had dawned cold and gray when the man turned aside the main Yukon Trail. He climbed the high earth bank where a little traveled trail led east the pine forest. It was a high bank and he paused to breathe at the top. He excused the act to himself by looking at his watch. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. There was no sun or promise of sun. Although there was not a cloud in the sky, it was a clear day. However, there seemed to be an indescribable darkness over the face of things. That was because the sun was absent from the sky. This fact did not worry the man. He was not alarmed by the lack of sun. It had been days since he had seen the sun. The man looked along the way he had come. The Yukon lay a mile wide and hidden under 3 feet of ice. On top the ice were many feet of snow, and it was pure white, north and south as far as the eye could see. It was unbroken white. The one thing that relieved the whiteness was a thin dark line that curved from the pine-covered island to the south and curved into the north, where it disappeared behind pine-covered island. The dark line was the trail, the main trail. It led south 500 miles to the Chilkoot Pass and saltwater. It led north 75 miles to Dawson, and still further on the north 1,000 miles to Nutlatu, and finally to St. Michel on the Bering Sea, 1,500 miles and 1,000 more. But all this, the distant trail, no sun in the sky, the great cold, and the strangeness of it all had no effect on the man. It was not because he was long familiar with it. He was a newcomer to the land, and this was his first winter. The trouble with him was that he was not able to imagine. He was quick and ready in the things of life, but only in the things, not in their meaning. 50 degrees below zero meant 80 degrees of frost. Such facts told him that it was cold and uncomfortable, and that was all. It did not lead him to consider his weakness as a creature affected by temperature, nor did he think about the general man's weakness, able to live only within narrow limits of heat and cold. From there, it did not lead to thoughts of heaven and the meaning of man's life. 50 below zero meant a bite of frost and hurt that must be guarded against by the use of mittens, ear coverings, warm moccasins, and socks. 50 degrees below zero was to him nothing more than 50 degrees below zero. And it should be more important than that was a thought that never entered his mind. As he turned to go, he forced some water into his mouth as an experiment. There was a sudden noise that surprised him. He tried it again and again in the air before they could fall to the snow. The drops of water became ice and broke with a noise. He knew that at 50 below zero, water from the mouth made a noise when it hit the snow. But this had done that in the air undoubtedly. It was colder than 50 below. But exactly how much colder he did not know, but the temperature did not matter. He was headed to the old camp on Henderson Creek, where the boys were already. They had come across the mountain from the Indian Creek country. He had taken the long trail to look at the possibility of floating logs on the island in the Yukon down the river when the ice melted. He would be in camp by 6 o'clock that evening. It would be a little dark after, but the boys would be there, a fire would be burning, and a hot supper would be ready. As he thought of lunch, he pressed his hand against a package under his jacket. It was also under his shirt, wrapped in a handkerchief, and lying for warmth against the naked skin. Otherwise, the bread would freeze. He smiled contentedly to himself as he thought of those pieces of bread, each of which enclosed a generous portion of cooked meat. He plunged among the pine trees, and the trail was not well marked here. Several inches of snow had fallen since the last sled had passed, and he was glad he was without a sled. Actually, he carried nothing but the lunch wrapped in a handkerchief. He was surprised, however, at the cold. It certainly was cold, he decided, as he rubbed his nose and face in his mitted hands. He had a good growth of hair on his face, but it did not protect his nose and the upper part of his face from the very frosty air. Following at the man's heels was a big native dog. It was a wolf dog, gray-coated and not noticeably different from its brother, the wild wolf. The animal was worried by the great cold. It knew that it was no time for traveling. Its known feeling was closer to the truth than the man's judgment. In reality, it was not merely colder than 50 degrees below zero. It was colder than 60 below, than 70 below. It was 75 degrees below zero. Because the freezing point is 32 above zero, it meant that there were 107 degrees of frost. The dog did not know anything about temperatures. Possibly in its brain there was no understanding of condition of cold, such as there was in the man's brain. But the animal sensed the danger. Its fear made it question eagerly every moment of the man, as if expecting him to go to camp or seek shelter somewhere and build a fire. The dog had learned about fire, and it wanted fire. Otherwise, it would dig itself into the snow and find shelter from the cold air. The frozen moistness of the breathing had settled on its fur in fine frosted powder. The hair on the man's face was similarly frosted, but more solidly. It took the form of ice and increased with every warm, moist breath on his mouth. Also, the man had tobacco in his mouth. The ice held his lips so tightly together that he could not empty the juice from his mouth. Ugh. Ugh. The result was a long piece of yellow ice hanging from his lips. If he fell down, it would break, like glass, into many pieces. And he expected the ice formed by the tobacco juice, having been out twice before when it was very cold. But it had not been as cold as this, he knew. He continued through the level of frost for several miles, and then he went down a bank to the frozen path of a small stream. This was Henderson Creek, and he knew it was 10 miles from where the stream divided. He looked at his watch, and it was 10 o'clock. He was traveling at a rate of 4 miles per hour. Thus he figured that he would arrive where the stream divided 12:30. He decided he would eat lunch when he arrived there. The dog followed again at his heels, and the trail hanging low, with its tail hanging low as the man started to walk along the frozen stream. The old sled trail could be seen, but a dozen inches of snow covered the marks of the sled. In a month, no man had traveled up or down the silent creek. The man went steadily ahead. He was not much of a thinker, but that moment he had nothing to think about except what he would eat for lunch at the stream's divide, and at 6 o'clock he would be in the camp with the boys. There was nobody to talk to, and had there been, speech would not have been possible because of the ice around his mouth. Once in a while, the thought repeated itself that it was very cold and that he had never experienced such cold. As he walked along, he rubbed his face and his nose with the back of his mitted hands. He did this without thinking, frequently changing hands. But with all this rubbing, the instant he stopped, his face and nose became numb. His face surely was frozen. He knew that he was sorry that he had not worn a sort of nose guard Bud wore when it was cold. Such a guard across the nose and covered the entire face, but it did not matter much, he decided. What's a little frost? A bit painful, that was all. It wasn't anything serious. Empty as the man's mind was of thoughts, he was most observant. He noticed the changes in the creek, the curves in the bend, and always he noted where he placed his foot. Once, coming around the bend, he moved suddenly to the side, like a frightened horse, curved away from the place where he had been walking, and retraced his steps several feet along the trail. He knew the creek was frozen to the bottom. No creek could contain water in that winter. But he knew also that there were streams of water that came out from the hillsides and ran along under the snow on the top of the ice of the creek. He knew that even in the coldest weather, these streams were never frozen. and he also knew their danger. They hid pools of water under the snow that might be inches deep or feet deep. Sometimes a skin of ice half of an inch thick covered them, and in turn it was covered by snow. Sometimes there was both water and thin ice, and when the man broke through, he could get very wet. That was why he had jumped away so suddenly. He had felt the ice move under his feet, and he had heard the noise of the snow covering the ice breaking. And to get his feet wet at such a temperature meant trouble, and it meant danger. At the very least, it meant delay, because he would be forced to stop and build a fire. Under only its protection could he bear his feet while he dried his socks and his moccasins. He stood and studied the creek bottom and its banks, and he thought a while, rubbing his nose and his face. Then he walked to the left. He stepped carefully to test the ice at each step. Once away from danger, he continued at his 4-mile pace. During the next 2 hours, he came to several similar dangers. Usually the snow above the pools had a sunken appearance. However, once again he came near to falling through the ice. Once, sensing danger, he made the dogs go ahead. The dog did not want to go. It hesitated until the man pushed it forward. Then it went quickly across the white, unbroken surface. Suddenly it fell through the ice, but it climbed out on the other side, which was firm. It had wet feet and legs almost immediately, and the water around them turned to ice. The dog made quick efforts to get the ice off of its legs, and then it lay down in the snow and began to bite the ice off that formed between his toes. The animal knew enough to do this. To permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet. It did not know this. It merely obeyed the commands that arose from the deepest part of its being. But the man did know these things, having learned it from experience. He removed the mittens from his right hand, and he helped the dog tear out each piece of ice. He did not bare his fingers for more than a minute, and it was surprised to find that they were numb. It certainly was cold. He pulled an old mitten back and beat his hand across his breast. And at 12 o'clock the day was at its brightest. Yet the sun did not appear in the sky. At 12:30 on the minute, he arrived at the divide of the creek, and he was pleased at his rate of speed. If he continued, he would certainly be with the boys at 6 o'clock this evening. He unbuttoned his jacket and shirt and pulled forth his lunch. The action took no more than a quarter of a minute, yet in that brief moment, the numbness touched his bare fingers. He did not put the mitten on, but instead stuck his fingers against his leg. Then he sat down on a snow-covered log to eat. The pain that followed the striking of his fingers against his leg ceased so quickly that he was frightened. He had not had time to take a bite of his lunch. He struck his fingers repeatedly and returned them to the mitten. Then he bared the other hand for the purpose of eating. He tried to take a mouthful, but the ice around his mouth prevented him. Then he knew what was wrong. He had forgotten to build a fire and warm himself. He laughed at his own foolishness. As he laughed, he noted the numbness of his bare fingers. Also, he noted that the feeling which had come to his toes when he sat down was already passing away. He wondered whether his toes were warm or whether they were numb. He moved them inside the moccasins and decided that they were numb. Then he pulled a mitten on and he stood up. He was somewhat frightened, and he stamped forcefully until the feeling returned to his feet. It was certainly cold, he thought. The man from the Sulphur Creek had spoken the truth when telling how cold it got sometimes in this country, and he had laughed at him at the time. That showed one must not be too sure of things. There was no mistake about it. It was cold. He walked a few steps, stamping his feet and waving his arms until reassured by the warmth again. Then he took out some matches and proceeded to make a fire with a bush. The high water had left a supply of sticks. From here he got wood for the fire. Working carefully from a small beginning, he soon had a very big roaring fire. Bending over the fire, he first melted the ice from his face. With the protection of the warmth of the fire, he ate his lunch. and for the moment the cold had been forced away. The dog took comfort near the fire as well, lying at its full length, close enough for warmth and far enough away to not be burned. When the man had finished eating, he filled his pipe with tobacco and had a comfortable time with the smoke. Then he pulled on his mittens, settled his cap firmly against his ears, and started along the creek trail towards the left. The dog was very sorry to leave and looked towards the fire. This man did not know cold. Possibly none of his ancestors had known cold, real cold. But the dog knew all of his family knew, and it knew that it was not able to walk outside in such fearful cold. It was a time to lie in a hole in the snow and wait for this awful cold to stop. There was no other option. But there was no real bond between the dog and the man. The one was the slave of the other, and the dog made no effort to indicate his fears to him. It was not concerned with the well-being of the man. It was for its own sake that it looked towards the fire. But the man whistled and spoke to it with the sound of a whip in his voice, and the dog started walking closer to the man's heels and followed him along the trail. The man put more tobacco into his mouth and started a new growth of yellow ice on his face. Again, the moist breath quickly powdered the hair around his face with white. He looked around him, and there did not seem to be so many pools of water under the snow on the left side of Henderson Creek. And for half the hour, the man saw no signs of any. And then it happened. At a place where there were no signs, the man broke through. It was not deep, it was wet up to the knees before he got out of the water onto firm snow. He was angry, and he cursed out loud. He had hoped to get into the camp with the boys by 6 o'clock, and this would delay him about an hour. Now he'd have to build a fire, dry his moccasins and his socks. This was most important at that low temperature, that he knew. So he turned aside to the bank, which he climbed. On top, under several small pine trees, he found some firewood which had been carried there by the high waters of last year. There were some sticks, but also larger branches and some dry grasses. He threw several branches on top of the snow, and severed for a foundation, and prevented the young flame from dying in the wet snow. He made a flame by touching a match to a small piece of tree bark that he took from his pocket. This burned even better than paper. Placing it on the foundation, he fed the young flame with pieces of dry grass with the smallest of dry sticks. He worked slowly and carefully, realizing the danger. Gradually, as the flames grew stronger, he increased the size of the sticks with which he fed it. He sat in the snow, pulling the sticks from the bushes under the tree and feeding it directly into the flame. He knew he must not fail. It was below 75 degrees zero. It was 75 degrees below zero, and the man must not fail in his first attempt to build a fire. This was especially true if his feet were wet. If his feet are dry and he fails, he can run along the trail for half a mile and keep his blood moving. But the blood in wet and freezing feet cannot keep moving by running when it's 75 degrees below zero. No matter how fast he runs, the wet feet will freeze even harder. That sounds awful. The man knew all of this. The old man on Sulphur Creek had told him about it, and now he was grateful for the advice. Already all feeling had gone from his feet. To build the fire, he had been forced to remove his mittens, and the fingers were quickly becoming numb. His pace for 4 miles an hour had kept his heart pushing and the blood to all parts of his body. But the instant he stopped, the action of the heart slowed down. He now received the full force of being cold. The blood of his body drew back from it. The blood was alive like the dog. Like the dog, it wanted to hide inside a sheet cover, away from the fearful cold. As long as he walked 4 miles an hour, the blood rose to the surface, but now it sank down to the deepest parts of his body. His feet and his hands were the first to feel its absence. His wet feet froze first, and his bare hands were next, although they had not yet begun to freeze. The nose and face were already freezing, while the skin of all his body became cold as it lost its blood. Ugh. But he was safe. Toes and nose and face would be only touched by the frost, because the fire was beginning to burn with strength. He was feeding it with a stick the size of his finger. In another minute, he would be able to feed it with larger branches. Then he could remove his wet moccasins and socks. While they dried, he would keep his naked feet warm by the fire, rubbing them first with snow. The fire was a success, and now he was safe. He remembered the advice from the old man on Sulphur Creek and smiled. The man had been very serious when he said that no man should travel alone in the country of 50 below. Well, here he was. He had had the accident. He was alone, but he had saved himself. Those old men were rather womanish, he thought. All a man must do was to keep his head, and he was all right. Any man who was a man could travel alone, but it was surprising, the rapidity of which his face and nose were freezing, and he had not thought his fingers could lose their feeling in such a short time. Without feeling, they were, because he found it very difficult to make them move together and grasp a stick. They seemed far from his body and from him. When he touched the stick, he had to look to see whether or not he was holding it. All of which mattered little. There was a fire promising life and a dancing flame. He started to untie his moccasins, and there was a coat of ice. The thick socks with the iron were like iron almost all the way up to his knees. The moccasin strings were like ropes of steel. For a moment he pulled them with his unfeeling fingers. Then, realizing the foolishness of it, he grasped his knife. Before he could cut the strings, it happened. It was his own fault. Or instead, his mistake. He should have not built the fire under the pine tree. He should have built it in an open space. But it had been easier to pull sticks from the branch and drop them directly onto the fire. But now the tree under which he had done this carried the weight of snow on its branches. No wind had been blowing for weeks, and each branch was very heavy with snow. Each time he pulled a stick, he shook the tree slightly. There had been just enough movement to cause the awful thing to happen. High up in the tree branch dropped its load of snow. It fell onto the branches beneath, and this process continued, spreading it through the whole tree. The snow fell without warning upon the man and the fire was now dead. Where it had burned was a pile of fresh snow. The man was shocked. It was like hearing his own judgment of death. For a moment he sat and stared at the spot where the fire had been. He grew very calm. Perhaps the old man on Sulphur Creek was right. If he had a companion on the trail, there would be no danger right now. The companion could have built the fire. Now he must build the fire again, and the second time he must not fail. Even if he succeeded, he would likely lose some toes. His feet must be frozen badly by now, and there would have some time before the second fire was ready. Such were his thoughts, but he did not sit and think them. He was busy all the time as they were passing through his mind. He made a new foundation for a fire, and this time in an open space where there were no trees above it. Next, he gathered dry grasses and sticks. He could not bring his fingers together or pull them to the ground, but he was able to gather them by the handful. In this way, he also got many pieces that were undesirable, but it was the best that he could do. He worked carefully, even collecting an armful of larger branches to be used later when the fire gathered strength. And all the while the dog sat and watched him. There was an anxious look in its eyes because it depended upon him, the fire provider, and the fire was slow in coming. When all was ready, the man reached his pocket for the second piece of bark. He knew the bark was there, although he could not feel it in his fingers. He tried and tried again, but he could not grasp it. All the time in his mind, he knew that each second his feet were freezing. This thought alarmed him, but he fought against it and kept calm. He pulled on his mittens with his teeth and began swinging his arms. Then he beat his hands with all of his strength against his sides. He did this while he was sitting, and then he stood up to do it. All the while, the dog sat in the snow, its tail curled warmly over its feet, and its sharp wolf ears were bent to look at the man. And the man, as he waved his arms and hands, looked like longing at the creature that was warm and secure in the covering provided by nature. After a time, he began to notice a feeling of his beaten fingers. The feeling grew stronger until it became very, very painful. But the man even welcomed the pain. He pulled the mitten from his right hand and grasped the tree bark from his pocket. His bare fingers were quickly numb again. Next, he brought out his pack of matches, but the awful cold had already driven the life out of his fingers again. In this effort to separate one match from the other, the whole pack fell into the snow. He tried to pick it out of the snow, but he failed. His fingers could neither touch nor hold. Now he was very careful. He drove the thought of his freezing feet, nose, and face out of his mind, and he devoted his whole soul to picking up the matches. He followed the movement of his fingers with his eyes, using the sense of sight instead of touch. When he saw his fingers on each side of the pack, he closed them. That is, he willed them to close, because his fingers did not obey. He put up the mitten on his right hand and beat it fiercely with his knee. Then, with both hands mitted, he lifted up the pack of matches along with much of the snow to the front of his jacket, but he had gained nothing. After some struggling, he managed to get the pack between his mittened hands. In this manner, he carried it to his mouth. The ice broke as he opened his mouth with a fierce effort. He used his upper teeth to rub it across the pack and under a separate single match, and he successfully got one, which he dropped on his jacket. His condition was no better. He could not pick up the match, and then he thought how he might do it. He picked up the match with his teeth and drew it across his legs. 20 times he did this before successfully lighting it. As it flamed, he held it with his teeth to the tree bark, but the burning smell went right up his nose, caused him to cough, and the match fell into the snow and died. And the old man on Sulphur Creek was right, he thought, in the moment of controlled despair that followed. After 50 below zero, a man should travel with a companion. He beat his hands but failed to produce any feeling in them, and suddenly he bared both hands, removing his mittens with his teeth. He caught the whole pack of matches between his hands. His arms and his muscles were not frozen, and he was able to press them tightly against the matches. Then he drew the whole pack along his legs, and it burst into flame, 70 matches all at once. Ugh. There was no wind to blow them out. He kept his head to the side to escape the burning smell, and held the flaming pack to the tree bark. As he held it so, he noticed some feeling in his hand. His flesh was burning, and he could smell it. The feeling developed into pain, and he continued to endure it. He held the flame of the matches to the bark that was not light ready, because his own burning hands were taking most of the flame. Finally, when he could endure the pain no more, he pulled his hands apart. The flaming matches fell into the snow, but the tree bark was burning. He began laying dry grasses and the tiniest sticks on the flame, and he could not choose carefully because it must be pieces that could be lifted between his hands. Small pieces of green grass stayed on the sticks, and he bit them off with his teeth. He treated the flame carefully. It meant life, and it must not cease. The blood had left his face, the surface of his body, and now he began to shake from the cold. A large piece of wet plant fell on the little fire, and he tried to push it out with his fingers. His shaking body made him push it too far, and he scattered the little fire into the wide space. Oh my gosh. He tried to push the burning grasses and the sticks back together again. Even with the strong effort that he made, his trembling fingers would not obey, and the sticks were hopelessly scattered. Oh my gosh. Each stick smoked a little and then died. The fire provider had failed. As he looked at him, his eyes noticed the dog sitting across the ruins of the fire from him. It was making uneasy movements, slightly lifting one foot from the other. The sight of the dog put a wild idea into his head, and he remembered a story from the old man. Caught in a storm, who had killed an animal and sheltered itself inside the body and thus was saved. Oh my gosh, he would kill the dog and bury his hands in the warmth of the body until feeling returned to them, and then he would build another fire. Oh my gosh. He spoke to the dog, calling it to him, but his voice had a strange note of fear and frightened the animal. It had never known the man to speak to it in that tone before, and something was wrong, and it sensed a danger. It knew not what danger, but somewhere in the brain arose a fear of the man. It flattened its ears at the noise of the man's voice. Its uneasy movements, the lifting of its feet became more noticeable, and it would not come to the man. He got down on his hands and knees and went over to the dog. It was an unusual position again, excited fear, and the animal moved away. The man sat in the snow for a moment and struggled for calmness. Then he pulled on his mittens using his teeth and stood on his feet. He glanced down to assure himself that he was actually standing, because the lack of feeling in the feet gave him no relation to the earth. His position, however, removed the fear from the dog's mind. When he commanded the dog in his usual voice, the dog obeyed, and it came to him. As it came within reach, the man lost control. His arms stretched out to hold the dog as he experienced real surprise, and then he discovered that his hands could not grasp. There was neither bend nor feeling in his fingers. He had forgotten for a moment that they were frozen and that they were freezing more and more. All this happened quickly, and before the animal could escape, he circled its body with his arms. He sat down in the snow, and in this fashion held the dog while it barked and struggled. Oh my gosh! But it was all he could do, hold its body encircled in its arms and sit there. He realized that he could not kill the dog. Good. There was no way to do it. His hands were frozen, and he could neither draw nor hold his knife, nor could he grasp the dog around the throat. He freed it, and it dashed wildly away, still barking. It stopped 40 feet away and observed him curiously, its ears bent sharply forward. The man looked down at his hands to locate them and found them hanging on the ends of his arms. He thought it curious that it was necessary to use his eyes to discover where his hands were. He began waving his arms and beating his mittened hands against his sides. He did this for 5 minutes, and he produced enough blood to stop his shaking, but no feeling was created in his hands. A certain fear of death came upon him, and he realized that it was no longer a mere problem of freezing his fingers or toes, or of losing his hands or feet. Now, it was a problem of life or death, with the circumstances against him. The fear made him lose control of himself, and he turned and ran along the creek to the old trail. The dog joined him and followed closely behind. The man ran blindly in such fear of his own life. Slowly, he struggled through the snow, and he began to see things again: the banks, the creek, the bare trees, and the sky. The running made him feel better, but he did not shake anymore, and he did not shake anymore. Maybe if he continued to run, his feet would stop freezing. Maybe if he ran enough, he would find the camp with the boys. Without doubt, he would lose some fingers and toes and some of his face. But the boys would take care of him, and save the rest of him when he got there. And at the same time, there was another thought in his mind that said he would never get to the camp and the boys. It told him that it was too many miles away and that the freezing was too great a start and that he would soon be dead. He pushed this thought to the back of his mind and refused to consider it. Sometimes he came forward and demanded to be heard. Sometimes it came forward and demanded to be heard, but he pushed it back and tried to think of other things. It seemed strange to him that he could run on feet so frozen that he could not feel them when they struck the earth and they took the weight of his body. He seemed to be flying along above the surface and had no connection to the earth. His idea of running until he arrived at the camp and the boys presented one problem: the lack of endurance. Several times he caught himself as he was falling. Finally, he dropped to the ground, unable to stop his fall. When he tried to rise, he failed. He must sit and rest, he decided. Next time, he would merely walk to keep going. As he sat and regained his breath, he noted that he was feeling warm and comfortable. He was not shaking, and it even seemed that a warm glow came to his body. And yet, when he touched his nose or face, there was no feeling. Running would not bring life to him, nor would it help his hands or feet. Then the thought came to him that his freezing portions of his body must be increasing. He tried to keep this thought out of his mind and tried to forget. He knew that such thoughts caused a feeling that frightened him, and he was afraid of such feelings. But the thought returned and continued, until he could picture his body totally frozen. This was too much, and again he ran wildly along the trail. Once he slowed to walk, but then thought that the freezing of his body would increase, and it made him run again. And all the time the dog ran with him at his heels. When he fell a second time, the dog curled his tail under his feet and sat in front of him, facing him, curiously eager. The warmth and security of the animal angered him. He cursed it until it flattened its ears, and this time the shaking, because of the cold, began more quickly. He was losing the battle with the frost. It was moving into his body from all sides, and this thought drove him forward. But he ran no more than 100 feet when he fell head first. I don't like this. It was the first moment of fear, and when he recovered his breath and his control, he sat and thought about meeting death with dignity. However, the idea did not come to him in that exact manner. His idea was that he had been acting like a fool, and he had been running around like a chicken with its head cut off. He was certain to freeze in his present circumstances, and he should accept it calmly. With this newfound peace of mind came the first sleepiness. A good idea, he thought, to sleep this way. Freezing was not so bad as people thought. He thought. He pictured the boys finding him the next day, and suddenly he saw himself with them, coming along the trail and looking for himself. And still with them, he came around the turn where they found him lying in the snow. He did not belong to himself anymore, though. Even then, when outside of himself, standing with the boys and looking at himself in the snow, it certainly was cold, he thought. When he returned to the United States, he could tell the folks that the cold was real. His mind went from this to the thought of the man from Sulphur Creek. He could see him quite clearly right now, warm and comfortable and smoking his pipe. "You were right, old fellow, you were right," he murmured to the man. The man dropped into what seemed to him the most comfortable and satisfying sleep he had ever known. The dog sat facing him and waiting, and the brief day ended in a long evening. There were no signs of a fire to be made. Never in the dog's experience had he known a man to sit like that in the snow and make no fire. As the evening grew darker, its eager longing for the fire mastered it. With much lifting of its feet, it cried softly. Then it flattened its ears, expecting the man to curse. But the man remained silent. Later, the dog howled loudly, and still later, it moved closer to the man and caught the smell of death. This made the animal back away. A little longer it delayed, howling under the stars that leaped and danced and shone brightly in the cold sky. And then it turned and ran along the trail towards the camp that it knew, where it knew that there would be food providers and fire providers. Jack London. That's a Jack London story for you. That felt like a classic Jack London. Yeah, that was fine. That was a fine story. I don't like thinking about being lost in the snow, though. Don't like that at all. Yeah. Short story by Jack London called To Build a Fire. Most of the short stories that I've read have been pretty dark. I wonder why that is. I don't like that very much. I'm going to find a happy one. Okay. Thank you for joining.